And we're back, and that means it's time for part 2 of our episode of catching up on things we've missed, which is finally getting around to our review of Crusade Armageddon. And yes, this is the... Like, we were used to doing one Crusade book a year, but we had, Nockmund was our most recent one, but now, just a few months later, we had Armageddon, which features... obviously, a return to the planet of Armageddon for the fourth war of Armageddon. And if we will give a short lore dive here and kind of retell the story of the book in very abbreviated format, if you want a nice long read on this, Arbiter Ian has a really good dive, not only into this, but into like all the wars of Armageddon leading up to this.
Right, yeah, they're great videos.
Yeah.
It doesn't work in an audio medium, but just imagine the little Kermit the Frog thing of, we're having a sequel. Like, that's basically what this is.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I will toss out, as we mentioned Imperial Armor earlier, this book had that same feel to me because I got maps, I got character bios, it felt really... I mean, the only thing it didn't have is Inquisition, like, text on the sides with a lot of redacteds.
Yeah. This is actually one of my favorite Crusade books, the way it's laid out, like the story and stuff. And I think it's partially because it is a conflict that we're more vested in. But, I don't know, this one's just done well.
Yeah, no, I think it is done well. And also, unlike some of the past ones like Pariah Nexus or even like Tyrannic War, this is a completed story. This story
does help.
It wraps up. It does have a conclusion. Nockmund had a conclusion as well.
Plus, World Eaters feature heavily, so, that's probably part of why I like it.
I mean,
you're saying we need a vote on Crusade book.
3 of the 4 of us have armies that are featured prominently, because Dennis, Space Wolves, featured very prominently.
Yeah.
Richard, Grey Knights.
Yep.
What about orcs?
And orcs, technically, they're not. They are here, but they're not featured prominently. But they do make an appearance. And then Kevin, World Eaters, obviously. Technically, I used to play Black Templars, so I'm kind of here.
You're here in spirit.
I'm here in spirit. Yeah. Otherwise, I'm not invested. And this is, and they do have the campaign set up with that third faction of, hey, you don't really fit anything, but you have your own goals, which is kind of where the orcs would sit. But storyline-wise, short version, both Njal Stormcaller and High Marshal Helbricht simultaneously have visions of someone coming to them and saying, doom comes for Armageddon, and seeing visions of blood and gore and horrible things happening. And
as an aside, that just has to be like a Tuesday in the Warhammer universe, right?
It really is.
That's what I was thinking.
I don't, at some point, when these blood gore prophecies show up, when do you stop acting on them?
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, go on.
So yeah, Njal goes to Logan Grimnar and says, I got this vision. And the Space Wolves have a history on Armageddon, even specifically with the very first war of Armageddon, which was against Angron and the World Eaters. And again, Arbiter Ian's got a great deep dive video onto that, and also explaining some of the difficulties this caused between the Space Wolves and the Grey Knights. Highly recommend watching that. Helbrecht, it meets with his people and is like, what is this vision? Is this from the Emperor or is this foul sorcery? Because it's the Black Templars. They're going to get hung up on suffer witch, not suffer witch. No, this is from the Emperor, not a witch. So the Space Wolves head to Armageddon, the Black Templars head to Armageddon, and at the same time, Angron is being drawn to Armageddon because ever since the Great Rift opened up, there have been problems on Armageddon because there's a lot of people who aren't aware of the First War of Armageddon because, like many things that involve the Grey Knights, they made sure to memory hole that as much as possible so that no one would think to look into what happened with Khorne on Armageddon.
It's probably fine.
I'm sure it's fine. And so there's a region of Armageddon called the Fire Wastes in the far north of the planet that is basically a desert and uninhabitable for the most part, but there are remnants there of the First War, including a warp portal called the Red Angel's Gate. And that has flared up ever since the Great Rift opened up, and that has been causing cults to pop up, demons to appear, guard units have been turning traitor. And so there's been trouble on Armageddon, but now it has reached the threshold of collapse one way or another. Now, the second and third wars of Armageddon were against orcs, and that's where, like, Commissar Yarick became very famous, and where, like, Chaplain Grimaldus from the Black Templars, who, the Black Templars have a history with Armageddon, specifically in the second and third wars. But orcs is never beaten, and in fact, they had basically been forced back into the equatorial jungles of the planet, and they had also taken over Hive. I've seen it called Hive Tempestus and Hive Tempestora in this book at the same time, but they control one Hive city, and they control the equatorial jungles. But otherwise, they're pretty much contained.
Okay, I want to know what an orc Hive city is like. That just seems crazy.
It's an Imperial Hive city that's now run by orcs.
No change.
Yeah.
And
That's fair.
Take your Necromunda guys and paint them green.
I mean, yeah, that's fair.
and so we get like the standard list of like, here's all the people defending Armageddon, here's all the Khornate invaders and heretics. And yeah, we do get the really good maps. The main continent, Armageddon Prime and Armageddon Secundus, is split by that jungle. The Space Wolves basically take Prime, the Black Templars take Secundus, and start trying to fight against the various traitors. And it is one of these back and forth wars. There are victories, there are defeats. There's a Hive city called Theratis, which is in ruins and is controlled by Khornate forces. Hive Hades is also in ruins, but controlled by Khornate forces. Those are on Secundus, and the Black Templars try to push them out. It doesn't go all that well, to the point where like they try to take Hades Hive, and the Black Templars are eventually forced to retreat because things are starting to go well, and then the traitors drop off 3 Chaos Titans.
As you do.
And while Helbrecht is doing his best to cut a path through the enemies at the feet of the Titan, he can't exactly duel a Titan to death. But that's when the Space Wolves show up in Storm Wolves, which is not a thing they have anymore, and drop off forces on top of one of the Titans. They fight their way into the Titan, put melta charges on the reactor, and then run away before it blows. So they're able to like stall the Khorne forces, but they do have to retreat from Hades Hide. Meanwhile, on the Armageddon Prime side, Hive Volcanus is like the main Imperial Hive city there, and they're fighting off attacks from Khorne forces when the orcs show up and say like, hey, there's a fight going on, we want to get involved. And they start fighting against the Khorne forces and anyone else they can get their hands on. Again, they don't play a major role, but they do distract the traitor forces enough to allow the Space Wolves and the Imperial forces there to kind of hold the day and hold the Hive City. Of course, all this murder is not doing good things for all the blood on the planet, and thus more and more Khorne demons show up. I know you're all for this.
I beg to disagree, but yeah.
And while all this is going on, there's also all these hidden remnants of Khorne like monoliths and Khornate monoliths and relics from the first War of Armageddon, and the Grey Knights are spending their time sending out strike teams to find these relics and destroy these monoliths to help weaken the warp's grip on Armageddon. And they're specifically looking for 8 shards of an item called the Black Blade, because they're going to try to use it. They need all 8 of those to try to create an exorcism, to like perform an exorcism to purge the planet of Khornate influence, because they know
the D&D campaign.
Yeah. Because they know there's this gate in the Fire Waste called the Red Angel's Gate, and they're like, we need to, until this is closed permanently, this will always keep happening. We have to purge the planet of this gate. And the only way we can do that is to exorcise the planet, exorcise Angron himself if needed. And so there's a grand there's Grandmaster Morvans is the head of the Grey Knights here on this planet, sent from Titan, and he is busy taking care of that, and he's coordinating with the Black Templars and the Space Wolves, and but also busy doing his own thing. And he eventually says, okay, so what we need to do is, now that Angron is showing up, we need to lure him into a trap. So here's this place called the Dialabus Forge complex. It's up in the mountains. It's got a bunch of subterranean chambers under it. You can basically like hold out there for a long time. We can draw these forces in. You can create kill zones, and we have something planned. I have people who have something planned for Angron. And he sends one of his brother captains deep down into the bowels of this fortress to find some stuff. And we don't find out what it is until the moment the trap is laid. And it's awesome. The fight is not going great, especially once Angron shows up, because he tends to murder everything he gets close to.
What?
Yeah, he does. Fights his way into a room where that brother captain, Taurus Hendron, is sitting there with his bodyguard in a hexagram that they've traced in like silver and bone. And at 6 points, it's the 6 points of this hexagram, there are vortex warheads that's what they were retrieving from the vaults underneath this complex. And
I mean,
he
that'll
starts
get her done.
And thing is, it's like he charges, and Angron knows it's a trap. And one thing I do like about the writing in this is they do show that, yes, the World Eaters are crazed psychopaths, but they're not stupid. They do have a strategy. Angron is still a Primarch. He recognizes that this is a trap. But he's also like, I'm smart, but he's like, I can just overpower them. So
I can just brute force it. Yeah.
Yeah. Because that's how he works. But it's like he knows how to do it vaguely strategically. But he charges into this hexagram and he's like, Khorne protects me from psychic shenanigans. I'll be fine. Charges in to the hexagram. The wards go up. His skin starts like to steam and burn. But that's not the thing. The point of this was never to trap Angron in this. Angron was drawn into this, but this was not to trap Angron. It was to trap the vortex explosions because they set off all 6 of them at once inside a bubble of psychic force. And that sends Angron away for a while.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, because Angron thought this was a trap to capture him. And it was, but it wasn't. And so, now granted, this has bad effects on the mountain that they're in, and a lot of people on both sides die, but it does take Angron off the field for a little while. And then so like that's the fighting on the like these main continents. Then it gets into the Fire Wastes, and there's 2 massive like remaining monoliths left that have to be taken out before this gate can be shut. And so there's the Brazen Citadel and the Gore Beacon, and those need to be taken out. But also they need to establish a beachhead on the Fire Wastes to even be able to do that. Imperial Titans make an appearance. Actually, they had made an appearance earlier when the Chaos Titans showed up, and the Chaos Titans were kind of starting to beat them. But because they were able to disrupt the Chaos Titans by blowing one of them up with Space Wolves, they were able to repair the damaged Titans. And there's this cool scene of them storming up out of the ocean with like seaweed hanging off of them and fighting and basically defeating Chaos Titans. So that is kind of a neat visual there. But they make a beachhead. They push the Khornate defenders of this area out, and they're able to set up and then do this 2-pronged attack. They send the Space Wolves after the Gore Beacon and the Black Templars after the Brazen Citadel. Both are nasty, drawn-out fights, but they are able to have the Grey Knights like basically purify the monolith at the Brazen Citadel and at the Gore Beacon. There's a fight between like the Space Wolves leader on the ground, Steerbjorn Flint Eye, and Jarek Skriel, who is a slaughter brute leading Exalted 8-bound, and they have a duel back and forth. And Flint Eye ends up, like, it's a Pyrrhic victory. He dies, but he ends up putting his axe into the head of Jarek Skriel and sending his bloodthirster back to the warp. And the Grey Knights are able to purify it. And so now all that remains is the Red Angel's Gate. In the end, the Grey Knights set up 8 paladins, each with the fragment of the Black Blade, chanting this exorcism, which then Angron shows back up.
It's just a flesh wound.
Yeah, well, you can't kill him forever. That's because he steps out. Like, Angron steps out of the Red Angel's Gate and is like, okay, I'm going to stop this. This makes me very angry. Everything makes him very angry. But
now I'm pissed.
Now I'm pissed, yeah. And so you've got these 8 paladins who are themselves defended by more Terminators, and there's like a little 2-page story focus of just the goriest deaths of Terminators as Angron is chopping his way through. But they manage to complete the ritual. Grandmaster Morven, who is riding a Nemesis Dread Knight, basically gets into one-on-one combat with Angron. Actually manages to, like, wound him, like, break his ribs just by punching him, but also Morven is getting very badly wounded and is bleeding out. In the end, of, like, his final burst of strength, he shoulder checks Angron, and they both go through the portal into the warp. And he dies, but then the Red Angel's Gate is closed and ceases to exist. So it's unlike Nachmund, we have an Imperial victory. Granted, most of these books, a whole ton of people died, but the Imperium wins and beats.
But they weren't named
beats
characters.
To the Cornet
so it's fine. Yeah, no, it's a good story. Like I like.
Yeah.
I like when they tell things like there's an impulse, I guess, with some of these to make them open-ended because they're meant to be played. You know, it's like, oh, play this thing, so like leave it open and you wrap up, and I'm like, I kind of like when they actually do like give us the resolution, give us the whole story, and then you can still play within that. So yeah, I don't know.
I totally agree with that, Kevin. And also, I remember back in the day, I love using that phrase now. Remember when we did some of the Tyranid versus Eldar fights of Eandon?
Yeah.
Those were a lot of fun. And that's a decided story, but being able to kind of go through the historical fights or kind of simulate what had happened there, that was a lot of fun.
Well, because even with the amount of detail that you get in here, or, you know, the amount of detail you would get in, you know, where it's Imperial Armor book, where it's like, you know, hundreds of pages of battles, these are still campaigns that take place over dozens of worlds, over continents, over years. So, like, there's plenty of space to go in and be like, yeah, we're going to have this battle that wasn't talked about in the book. So I think there's still plenty of space to work within these, even though you kind of know the beginning and the end. I don't know. I just kind of like this way of storytelling a little bit more than the let's just leave it open for future things.
Well, and even within that, like, you know, these are massive battles with thousands and thousands of troops. And you can always have a game like this is this particular group going against this particular enemy formation on this battle line. Like there's so much room for this to be played, you know, forever. And also there's the whole fun of, so what if this went differently? You know, there's, I mean, like that's half of historical wargaming right there. And these are kind of the sci-fi equivalent of that. It's like, you know, people play the Battle of Waterloo over and over again, and with Napoleonic wargaming, they're like, but what if it happened differently? What if could Napoleon have won the battle? And so this is kind of like, could the World Eaters have actually won here? Like, was there like, what would have, if something had gone slightly differently, what could have worked out? Or like, this is our version of it. You can always alternate universe this. This is, you know, but yeah, having a self-contained story with a lot of room to play around in is really cool. Again, as all the Crusade books do, this contains all the Crusade rules, like the generic Crusade rules. We can safely skip past those. They're pretty much the same in every one of these books. Then we get into what makes an Armageddon campaign different. And so first off, I want to say the campaign system here is blessedly simple. So much simpler than the Nachmund simple.
I'll chime in a little bit of the fact that this doesn't have the reserves like the Knockmen did.
Yeah.
Because I had heard that that's what happened at the Dallas narrative, is they were playing by the Knockmen rules, so everybody's army had to be broken up into the reserves, and these were 1,000-point games.
Yeah, that doesn't work.
I'm kind of glad. I like that as a concept. I wouldn't mind playing a game or two of that, but I kind of am glad that we're moving away from that with this newest one, and it makes me think that this is probably the book that will be the main rules that come out for Grand Narrative. So
yeah, I would think so. Yeah.
Also, something I like here is that they give you an idea for like how fast do you want your campaign to be? How many games per phase? And they're like, hey, if you just want to play through this really fast, you could do this in 4 games. But we kind of intend for it to be played in 4 phases of 3 games each. If you want to take longer, just use more games. I like that. They're like a game a week, so like you could play through this over months if you wanted to.
I do like how this is spelled out, because I know in previous ones, like when we ran our Crusade down here in Dallas, we pretty much did it round robin, where each phase was you played every other player that was not in your faction. Mm-hmm. And so things took a long time. But we also wanted that because, I mean, some of those upgrades in leveling up your characters also takes a long time. So, I mean, if you only had a Crusade that goes 4 games, like 1 game each phase, I mean, you'll be done, but you won't really get that feel of the upgrades. So what are you more after? More of the story and narrative? You'll want less games. More of the, I'm going to power up my guys. You want to drag it out as long as you can.
Right. And I do also like that the way this is set up, yes, they set up 3 alliances you can play as, but I feel like the Marauders Alliance is completely optional. If you wanted to split this into 2, it would still work fine because of the way it works. Basically, at the end of each campaign phase, you earn strategic points, and whichever alliance has the most strategic points gets its narrative goal. You win a campaign point. Whoever has the most strategic points wins, and then campaign points are tiebreakers. So like the more of your strategic goals that you succeed at, the more likely you are to win if there's a tie. But that's it. Like there's not a whole lot like tracking all the different areas or things like that. You're not tracking like Blackstone points that you spend or anything like that. The campaign system, very easy, and it's arranged as a tree. Basically everybody starts at point 1, which tells you like how many strategic points you earn for a particular goal. And then here's other thing, like, and then if you succeed, you go to this branch. If you fail, you go to this branch. And basically it's like there's 2 sets of alternates for rounds 2 and rounds 3. And then when you get to round 4, everything comes back to a common point.
Yeah, I really like this tree structure between the different phases, because it gives you kind of a codified way of feeling like things are moving forward, rather than just, oh yeah, the Tyranids have their mission, the Eldar have their mission. This kind of ties it all together and gives you more of a narrative feel for each of the phases.
Yeah. And each one of these, like, hey, if you win this phase, then you get a special ability the next phase. If you lose this phase, you get a special ability in the next phase, but it'll change which branch you go down. And then if you win that second one, you can get back up into the good branch, and then it comes back down into the final story branch. So I like this. It's not a very complicated tree structure, but it has rewards and has catch-up mechanics kind of built in, special abilities. I do like this a lot.
So one thing that we always do, like Dennis and I, we always go through and like look at these books and like pull something out to use in like the narrative campaign. We did it with, the deep strikes and stuff like this. I love hellscapes. Like I want to incorporate this. I want to incorporate this into the narrative for next year. Okay. So like if the chaos faction is winning, then you start using hellscapes. And like it's a way to add and modify to the tables and like to the missions without having to like add in like terrain. I love these. I think these are great.
So you heard it here first. Be ready for hellscapes next year.
Yeah. So here's one thing I'm going to say. I have mentioned that the campaign system is very simple, very elegant. I really like it. That's because the missions have so many add-ons. It's probably the most complex set of missions they've ever had.
The missions are very complicated for sure.
Yeah. So there are 18 missions in here. Or actually, no, I guess there's just, is it 14? 14, because there's if you roll a 3-3, then you roll on the other table. And if you roll a 3-3, and whichever table you're on, you roll on the other one. So there's like 14 missions in here. Every one of those missions has a predetermined hellscape that it uses. And if that were all, that I'd be like, okay, hellscapes, that's an easy add-on, but it's not just hellscapes, because there's also warp anomalies. And it's not just warp anomalies, it's also unbound adversaries representing just demons that nobody controls that are showing up on the field. And they all have their own AI that they're supposed to use, because you don't have a player controlling them, they just do their own thing. So every mission has a hellscape. Hellscapes may have a rule, they may have an action you can take, they may have their own bespoke anomaly that shows up when you roll an anomaly. I'll get to how the anomalies work in a minute. And they do give you a table for rolling up random hellscapes for using them in other missions. Like I said, the missions here, the hellscapes are predetermined. You use this hellscape on this mission. And they could be anything from folded space, which you can perform. All it does is you can perform an action to redeploy yourself somewhere more than 3 inches away from an enemy model, and you give yourself a warp counter. What do warp counters do? Depends on the mission, depends on the anomalies. Different things happen. Warp counters are just kind of a generic token that they can use to do different effects in different missions. Sometimes a warp counter is not a terrible thing. Then there's the hellscape of fading reality, which can make units with warp counters go away. Fading reality, from the second battle round onwards, at the end of your opponent's turn or at the end of the battle, whichever happens first, roll a d6 for each unit from your Crusade army not wholly inside your deployment zone. On a 4-up, give that unit a warp counter. Then, for each unit from your Crusade army that has 2 or more warp counters, remove it from the battlefield. It is destroyed, but does not have to take an out-of-action test. If that unit is a transport, and there are 1 or more units in it, they are also destroyed. So, you got warp counters? Gone. Just, you cease to exist. And they give you an action that says, at the end of your phase, like if you do nothing from your shooting phase onward, you can remove all warp counters from your unit. And if you roll the random bespoke anomaly for this one, your units may gain warp counters, or you may, you pick a unit for each player, and that unit may lose a warp counter or gain a warp counter. So, that one, very complex. Fractured Realm creates rifts from objective markers. And if you're wholly within a rift, every time you make an attack, you must target it must target a unit within the rift. You can't fight outside the rift. Scattered coordinates. Everybody has infiltrators. Every time you set up a unit using Deep Strike, they must be more than 9 inches away, like standard Deep Strike stuff, and within 6 inches of battlefield edge. So you can't Deep Strike in the middle of the table unless somebody performs an action with a signal flare to allow somebody to Deep Strike normally. But when they Deep Strike, they gain warp counters. Staggered time. If for each of your units with 1 or more warp counters at the end of their movement phase, you can remove them. If you do... So at the end of your opponent's movement phase, you can move your own units if they have warp counters. And then in your shooting phase, you can choose to do an action to gain a warp counter. They're neat rules. Some of them are more complex than others, because some of them have more pieces going on.
Sure. But this is the kind of chaotic gameplay that I love.
Well, the other thing about it, like you mentioned, Rob, it's sort of like instead of putting these word for word on the mission rules, they've kind of broken them out so you can kind of pick and choose if you're creating your own stuff. Like, okay, I'm going to do this style mission, but with this hellscape, and I don't know. It feels like it's broken out to make you have options if you want to create your own stuff.
Yeah, and I find the hellscapes. I think the only thing I find complex again about them is that not all of them have the same components. Some have anomalies, some don't. Things like that. But that they're relatively fine. And, adding one of these into your own mission, not terrible. Definitely workable.
Yeah.
The thing I found the most confusing, and the chart they put together did not help. The diagram did not help.
The chart.
Is the warp events, the anomalies. So, Each mission in the book details the potency of warp events you will experience during that mission, known as the scale and intensity. Depending on the scale and intensity of the warp events, generate anomalies as described on the warp events matrix, which is a circular chart where things are cut into minor, major, and catastrophic, and that tells you how many anomalies you will set up and when they're going to happen. So a minor local warp anomaly, you will generate one anomaly at the start of the second battle round. So you'll just get one anomaly on one turn. If it was a planet-wide major warp event, you will generate 3 anomalies at the start of the battle round. And if it's, and you could have widespread catastrophic, which is 2 anomalies generated every turn. Those are predetermined, again, on the missions. Like, the missions will tell you, like, local catastrophic, planet-wide minor, stuff like that. And then there's an extra chart, and I think what threw me here is on that matrix, there's also a little die chart showing, like, what you roll to figure out the scale and intensity if you want to use anomalies in another mission. Again, this is a piece you could add on to anything separate from Hellscapes. It does play with Hellscapes, but you don't have to. And also, the missions in this book have a particular warp surge anomaly that happens if you roll an 11 on the 3d6 chart. The anomalies themselves do all sorts of weird things. Like, if you rolled 3 1s, you get Demonic Assault. For each unit on the battlefield that has 1 or more warp counters, that unit suffers d6 mortal wounds for each warp counter it has. That might be worse than the fading, I don't know. If you rolled a 7, fell innervation until the next time anomalies would be generated for each unit with 1 or more warp counters, subtract 1 from their toughness. But sometimes what if you rolled a 15? Starting with the attacker, each player selects 1 unit from their Crusade army that has 1 or more warp counters. Until the next time anomalies would be generated, weapons equipped by models in those units have lethal hits. So sometimes they can be good for you, sometimes they can be bad. And because on a 3d6, 10 and 11 are the 2 most common results on average. A 10 is empiric, resolve the Hellscapes empiric anomaly if it has one. If it doesn't have one, otherwise, starting with the attacker, each player selects 1 unit and gives that unit a warp counter. On an 11, you perform the mission surge anomaly. If it doesn't have one, then starting with the attacker, same thing. You give warp counters. So your most common result is going to be warp counters, even if you're not doing one of these missions. And the anomalies all play around with the warp counters, as do a lot of the Hellscape abilities. So they do interact very well with each other, but I do like that they are modular enough that you wouldn't necessarily have to use them together, because most of the things that use warp counters in Hellscapes kind of generate their own or don't impact anything at all. Like, they're separate, but like they are modular enough to use them separately. But it can be a lot to track, especially if you're at the catastrophic, you're generating 2 or 3 of these every turn, like each player's turn. This could get crazy very quickly. Like, build in time for your games, because it's a lot. And then there's the Unbound Adversaries, which tells you, okay, like, there are lesser demons, abominations, demonic beasts, and greater demons. They give you ideas of what models to use to represent them, but they have generic data sheets, so you don't have to worry about being Cornate greater demons or Nurgle lesser demons. Like, this is not so tied to a chaos god that you couldn't use it for any campaign against demons and the forces of chaos, which I do appreciate that. But that also means that if you are going to use Unbound Adversaries, which I will also tell you, a lot of the missions here have Unbound Adversaries baked in. The official missions want you to use them. That does mean you're going to have somebody in your group who has models to set aside to use as these. So if you're going to run one of these campaigns, have somebody in your group that has demon models, or pick a faction. Like, they could be Tyranid models, technically. You know, as long as the sizes are right. Or you could run them as orcs. Like, if you want to have, these are unbound orcs that are showing up. Sure, why not?
And I will call out, like we said earlier in the episode, the adversaries, they tell you what size bases they're on too. So
yes,
I like that they're defining all of that.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, lesser demons are infantry models on 32 millimeter round bases. Example: bloodletters. Chaos abominations, infantry or beast models on 50 millimeter rounds. Example: chaos spawn. Demonic beast, mounted or beast models on 75 or 90 millimeter oval bases. Example: blood crushers. And greater demons, monster or walker models on a 100 mil round, 120 mil oval, or 130 mil round. Example: bloodthirster. That would also cover most of the greater demons.
But no defilers.
No defilers can't. Defilers cannot be fit into as greater demons. Greater demons are just not strong enough to be defilers. But like they'll tell you like a power level for the unbound adversaries, which will like you roll on it. Like for that power level, you roll a d6, and they'll tell you like what gets used. It's like if you roll power level 1, if you rolled a 1 to 3, 10 lesser demons. But power level 3 and you rolled 4 to 6, greater demon. And then many of the campaign and mission rules in this book state if you should use unbound adversaries rules, and if so, those rules state what units you should set up and when. If you don't have suitable models, you do not have to use them. I do appreciate them making that clear.
Yeah.
You don't have to use this even in these missions, but they do say the experience is going to be different. You're not going to get the full intent of this if you don't use them. And then if the missions don't state whether or not you should use unbound adversaries, you and your opponent can still agree to use them. And then for random adversaries, they tell you like, okay, so roll this, and it'll tell you like what power level and how many units to roll up, where to set them up. Interestingly, they don't control objective markers, but they do have an OC for determining whether it's contested or not. So they make it clear like these can't hold an objective, but they could stop you from holding it. Again, their AI basically in the movement phase, they always move as close as possible to the closest enemy unit. And in the shooting phase, if they can shoot, they shoot at the closest eligible target. If they can charge, they must charge the closest enemy unit. And when they fight, they will always consolidate towards enemy units, never towards objectives.
I mean, that's very straightforward. And it does put a movable obstacle in the game, because if you get close to them, or if you're the closest thing to them, they're coming after you.
Right.
But do you spend the time to go away from them and try and let them go to your opponent? Or do you just shoot them and try and get rid of them, but then you're not shooting your opponent? So it does add an extra element to the game.
Yeah.
I like it because it harkens back to the old like rogue trader rules where like random foes could appear on the table and you had a game master that was running stuff. Like, I don't know. It just seems fun.
Yeah. And they do specify, hey, if there's ever a time where an unbound adversary could go one of two ways, like both are equally legit options, the player who has the most warp counters on their units gets to decide for that phase. Which is kind of fun. You know, it's a mechanic like, oh, you've picked up a lot of warp counters, you have control over the warp. Haha, you can direct them wherever you want. There are agendas that work at unbound adversaries in, so they point out like even though they aren't technically enemy models, because your enemy refers to your opponent's army, a lot of these agendas do take those into account. Like, hey, you get extra XP for killing enemy characters or unbound adversary characters. If you destroy enemy or unbound adversary units for one, you get extra XP, things like that. Do appreciate that that is worked in so that they don't mess up the gameplay otherwise. And then there are tactical agendas. So instead of choosing an agenda, you can roll up a random one, which feels like the old Winds of Battle objectives. Because like there's Line Breaker, Revel in Carnage, Raise the Standard, Strategic Dominance, you know, all rewarding you for things you could do in game. So it's like, I don't need any of these agendas. I will generate tactical ones. And then if it's a tactical agenda, after you succeed at it, you generate a new one. So it's like playing a match play with tactical objectives, except now they're tactical agendas. I do like this. I like this is fun for narrative play, especially in an environment where the warp is constantly changing. Your goals may change. The missions themselves, as I said, all of them have hellscapes. All of them have warp events. Most of them have unbound adversaries, or at least reference unbound adversaries. Seal the Rifts, one of the last ones, does not have unbound adversaries. And unbound adversaries have their own deployment zones in some of these missions.
Yeah, some of the mission layouts and designs are just wild.
Yeah. There's temporal flux is really like it's the like from middle of the board to one corner, like the opposite corner for the players, but then inside the no man's land there's these weird little triangles of unbound adversary deployment zones. But I also like seeing maps that play around with deployment zones in interesting ways.
Yeah, they seem fun, but the one I especially like is the Assault on Warp Gate, where you have to do trigonometry to figure out the circles.
Yeah.
that's not going to be a pain in the ass.
No, not at all.
To me, Breakout seemed kind of like a fun mission because the defender's trying to leave the board and has to get through the unbound adversaries while the attacker's behind them trying to catch up and wipe them out.
Yeah,
that's fun.
That one's going to be really rough for the defenders.
Well, and that's also a mission where it's really rough for the defenders unless you don't have somebody who can provide unbound adversaries. That's one of those missions where it's like, if you don't have unbound adversaries, there's no point in playing that one because that's half the reason you play that.
Right.
Correct.
But like looking at these, Brazen Bridge is interesting, which there's an area of the board that is literally like a bottleneck that there's 10 inches on either side of the board that no one can move through unless you can fly. No terrain there. Can't move through it unless you have fly. And it must be in no man's land. And the no man's land that is the bridge also can have no terrain on it. So there's just this band in the table that has no terrain, and either side of it is a chasm that nobody can cross unless they can fly, and they have to be able to fly across the whole thing in one move.
And the unbound adversaries are pretty much guarding the bridge.
Yes, because that's where they come in from.
Yep, the chasms.
Yep. And there are objective markers in each deployment zone. At the end of the game, if you control your own deployment zone, you get 20 points. If the attacker controls the defender's deployment zone marker, they get 40 points. If neither player controls the objective marker in the defender's deployment zone, so if the attacker can push you off of it, they get 20 points. If the attacker can take it, they get 40 points. The defender has the hardest job they only get 20 points if they hold their own.
The main one is securing the bridge, because that's your cumulative one.
Right. And you've got like special zones you have to set up in the defenders like front lines, because it marks them like zone A, zone B, zone C. Do those ever get referenced in the mission though?
They're part of the unbound adversaries and how you can deploy them.
Well, no, those are the entry points. But if you look at the defender's deployment zone, then there's like zone A, zone B, zone C. And I'm not sure what those do.
Yeah, they're not referenced at all. Maybe it was something they planned on and then they scrapped.
Yeah, it must be.
But yeah, flipping through the missions, I think they're all interesting. I do agree they really feel like they were designed with the unbound adversaries in mind. So I don't know, like in our little play group, how much we're actually going to use them. I like the early parts of the tree for the format, for the phases and all of that. But when we get into the missions, I'm a little torn because, like you said, Rob, having a hellscape tacked on with the anomalies, tacked on with unbound adversaries, you're adding a lot of parts. I mean, if you have a day to do a Crusade game, sure, take your 3-4 hours, have fun. But if you want to try and get a couple games in a day, tacking a lot of this on is just kind of like Crusade is in general. You're just adding in more things that you have to keep track of.
Right, and you're having to keep track of some of those now on a turn-by-turn basis, depending on how often the anomalies kick off and whatever your hellscape rules are for that particular mission. And also, beyond that, these missions also often have their own special rules as well on top of those. So it's like, it is a lot, and this is definitely, while I could see elements of this being used for like the grand narrative, I do think that the time involved and the number of things you have to keep track of is going to be a lot, and unless that is included in the packet so everybody has access to it, that's a lot to put on the players to make sure you all have this book too.
Two things I'll tack on. One, at the end of the book, so we're about at the end of the book, they do have a tear out page that you can carry around with you that has both the hellscapes and the anomalies there, which I thought was really cool.
That is really good.
But part two, I could see them using this in the grand narrative at a macro level because each of the little planets, aka rooms, they could probably say, okay, in this room, based on previous results games, this room now has these anomalies happening. And then maybe a different room would have a different thing. So I could see them doing it more at a macro level as opposed to at the individual game turn level.
Well, and in the last 2 years, they've had bespoke custom missions.
Yeah, I'm expecting the missions to be that way,
yeah, they won't have these missions, but I think they will use some of these systems.
Concepts, yes.
Yeah. Which I like the fact that they've broken out the anomalies and the hellscapes. Obviously, in these missions, like, it's all meant to work together, but they've given you the tools to do the unbound adversaries. They've given you the tools to do these systems that you can add in other places and other missions as kind of overlays, and I really like that flexibility.
Yeah, no, I do like that these are modular components that play well together but are not required for each other. Like, I really like the campaign system. I like the hellscapes. I'm a little bit less enthused at the anomalies just because I feel like they got a little cutesy with the presentation and didn't make that as...
I like the chart.
It does not parse well.
Fair. And it parsed well for my brain, so whoever designed it, probably it parsed well for them, not asking other people, does this parse well?
Right.
They have the same ADHD brain as you do.
Yeah. One other concern I do have with these, besides just all the myriad pieces going on, is some of the missions, like setting up the so that breakout mission that we talked about, where you're trying to get through the unbound adversaries to get to and escape as the defender. The unbound adversaries says set up at after the deploy Crusade army step, the attacker sets up 3 power level 3 unbound adversaries within the deployment zone, which could be 3 greater demons. Like, that is absolutely what could be rolled up. That's a lot to get through if you're playing a 1,000-point army. These don't scale with the size of the battle you're playing. So just be aware of that.
I think I don't remember which page, but I thought in here they'd said that it was tuned for 2,000.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah. Yeah, because if I remember correctly, in Nachman, they had various...
different levels.
Yeah, different levels. So I did notice that these all look to be 2,000-point standard missions.
Like, they do say on the Crusade, like, oh yeah, you can play these at Incursion, but it definitely feels like these are meant for larger armies, because otherwise you could struggle just to deal with the mission rules themselves if you use all the components.
Right.
I think this could get really tricky at 1,000 points, and even like at 1,000 points, some of the hellscape rules could be very punishing. Like that fading reality. Oh, look, I'm at 1,000 points. One of my units has disappeared. That could be a third of my army, especially if it was somebody in a transport. Yeah, I don't think this is tuned for 1,000 points, even though it is listed as an option. It definitely feels like it's tuned for 2,000 to 3,000 points. I think at 3,000 points, this would be, just because of the sheer number of units you'd be using, this would be a lot to juggle. Also, unlike Nachman or some of the past missions where there were a couple of missions near the end that were made for like the 3,000 point game with like the extra wide table,
well,
not all of these are standard sized.
They do call out your battlefield for the 3,000 should be 44 by 90.
Okay, which will be interesting for, like, I guess that means for the assault the warp gate, your opponent, like the attacker, will have even more deployment zone to use, because the defender's deployment zone is going to be the same size either way.
If it was a wider table, the defender would have more.
No, because the defender's is fixed at an 18-inch radius circle.
Yep.
Oh, fair.
That's what I mean. The assault the warp gate, the defender side and the unbound side are fixed size.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the attacker would just have so much more space to use.
Yeah, I guess I didn't catch that, even though they did call out the onslaughts are in the bigger table, but there's no mission setups that call out bigger tables.
Right. And also, it's like, what would that do to something like Breakout, where all the measurements are, like, would the escape zone then just be like an extra 15 inches on each side? These are definitely built and balanced around 2,000 point armies. if you use all the rules, I think 1,000-point armies suffer because there's things that they won't be able to deal with well, and 3,000-point armies will suffer because these tables are too small, and some of the maps adjust for them, but several of the more interesting missions where like the deployment zones and things like that play a bigger role will be harder to really utilize well. Just something to keep in mind. Again, 2,000 is what most people play, so a lot of people won't necessarily be affected by this. But if you were doing 1,000-point Crusade play like you do, Dennis, or if you're doing like an escalation league where you're starting off small and working up, those first few games, if you're using Crusade rules, could be really tough.
Yeah, our group here is people are starting to get enough models to breach the 2,000. So between that and proxying, I think, and especially with the grand narrative being 2,000, I think we're going to ratchet our stuff up to 2,000, other than if we do team games. But then team games, they're still technically 2,000 on a side. So
yeah. And the other thing I will say is that while this definitely does provide all the standard Crusade stuff like blessings and agendas and specific battle honors and things like that and Crusade relics, it does bring back the Mighty Champions rule so that you can have your epic heroes take part and not feel like you're losing out by taking one.
I just feel that's a standard going forward.
I think it will be.
So.
I like the fact that other than, well, I would say the Crusade campaign, a lot of the benefits are very Crusade specific, like getting extra requisition points or Crusade relics, things like that. Otherwise, I would say the missions themselves don't necessarily lean so hard into Crusade stuff that you couldn't play them without the Crusade system.
Because like previous ones, collect Blackstone or do the, I mean, you had direct ties. And here, I mean, the warp charges are the only, I guess, direct tie you have, but those feel, I guess you're not collecting they're so fluid that it doesn't feel like.
And the warp charges, the warp counters are more to interact with the anomaly and the hellscape rules rather than really caring about your Crusade army.
Exactly.
There are Crusade abilities that interact with warp counters and things like that, but you don't need those. So if you don't like all the bookkeeping of Crusade, if you don't like the power differentials, and let's be honest, Crusade can get wildly unbalanced if somebody has a long-standing Crusade army and someone else is just starting out. That can be not fun to play against.
You mean the blessings don't even that out?
They do not at all. So yeah, like I have problems with Crusade. I don't like. I think Crusade itself is a neat idea, but poorly implemented and poorly balanced. And I know its narrative is not meant to be balanced, but it can still lead to a lot of feel bads, which is the opposite of what you want from narrative play. If it's if you end up with very one-sided games. So I do like that a lot of this will work without the Crusade. But like I still think these are because of all the moving components, these are the most complex Crusade missions they've ever used. Because to get everything, you have to use all the components to get the full feel of the mission. I think a lot of these just don't play right if you don't have the Unbound Adversaries, if you don't have the Hellscape rules, things like that. And yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at. I think the missions are interesting but very complex. I think the individual components of the missions are neat. I think, and I'm with you, Kevin. I think using Hellscape for doing a like chaos versus the universe kind of campaign would be a lot of fun. That and the warp anomalies. I think I might keep the warp events to a minimum. Yeah, I don't know if I'd do anything more often than start of the battle round or start of the turn, but limit it to one.
Well, I was kind of thinking that like
two around.
in like the Midwest Conquest narrative perspective of it, it might be fun to like roll the intensity and stuff like that, like globally, and like okay, have like, and then it's like okay, we got planet wide. Okay, each turn, the person running the campaign is going to like roll for like the start of the turn, and like that's what it is for turn 1 and turn 2 and stuff like that. I think that could be fun, and that's also a way to kind of centralize it, so you're not necessarily having to like have the players remember it. But I think there could be a lot of fun with that But yeah, you might want to limit or make some adjustments to it.
Yeah.
But I think the hellscapes are fun.
Yeah. No, I think they give you the tools here to tailor it to the kind of experience you want, which is the sign of a good Crusade system. I think this giving you a lot of pieces in a way that I don't feel like Nachmund did. I think Nachmund, outside of like surgical deep strike, which we love and we'll always use if it's at all possible, if it's at all available, I feel like Nachmund put more restrictions on you because of the like having to break your army into like thirds or quarters and have everything come up in like as reserves. I felt like Nachmund's missions are not as like, it's a harder experience, especially at smaller game sizes. And so I feel like it gave me less to add into my own stuff, whereas this I feel like gives you a lot more tools to make interesting campaigns out of that aren't not necessarily tied to Armageddon. So I would say if I wanted to give my review of this, I would say story is fantastic. One of the better, Nachmund had a very good story too. It's nice to see a story where the Imperium actually comes out on top on one of these, which seems to be a rarity.
Whatever.
But nice contained story, and actually moves the story of the planet of Armageddon forward, which is also nice. It's nice to see like a major element of like 40k lore actually advance storyline wise, so that's always good. So narratively, this is a great book. Campaign system, really dig the campaign system. It's a little bit tightly tied to the Crusade aspect, but it's a Crusade book, so I shouldn't be surprised. And then the add-ons for missions, very interesting, but a lot to juggle when you use all the pieces together. To the point where I feel like if you could rank I think I've mentioned this before, like on certain like Crusade books, it feels like, man, could you rank the difficulty of this to use? This would be a very much an advanced player's Crusade book, just because it kind of has expectations of you're going to have these extra minis to use for unbound adversaries, and you're going to have to know how to play very sharply because there's going to be a lot of curveballs thrown at you constantly just by the missions and the add-ons. So definitely for advanced players, but if you are an advanced player who wants to do some neat narrative stuff, I think it's a good book overall.
No, I will agree. That's kind of my take on it is I like the book. I like the concepts for the different add-ons and missions. I might want to try out some of the missions just to play them because they're cool concepts, but I don't know if I'll end up playing a Crusade with this book.
Yeah.
Also, and this just as an aside, when are we going to get the campaign book for the grand narrative? Dang it, I was there. I want my book. We'll get to it eventually, I'm sure.
Well, one day it'll be there.
Yeah. Someday, Kevin. Someday.
But yeah, I think that pretty much actually, one thing I am surprised that with as much focus there is on like Khornate stuff, it feels like the Grey Knights were there and they did very important things narratively, and they're featured in a lot of the artwork, but it just feels like there's not a lot of focus, and maybe there's more in the like the relics and things like that, which I never look too much at the relics because most of the relics are impossible to actually achieve. But it just feels like, man, for an army that feels like so necessary, they don't feel, I don't know, I just don't get the feel that they're represented. But I guess just by nature of its warp stuff, the Grey Knights are there.
Right. And if you want more Grey Knights, I believe, they should have a codex coming soon, right?
Theoretically, they've got a new combat patrol coming with the old boxy Little Dread now.
Oh.
Yeah.
No Primaris Grey Knight Dreadnought for you.
Yeah.
But yeah, theoretically, they and Black Templars have books coming soon. We've seen a couple of new Black Templars models, including the most unfortunately named chaplain, the Execrator, who everyone immediately looks like, and it's like, oh look, the Excretor. Poorly chosen name. But we'll see what happens with them. And of course, that's also, Grey Knights are going to theoretically have their own Crusade rules too, so who knows what that will do pinned on top of this. So let's make this really confusing. But I'd say that's pretty much our take on on Armageddon. Really cool stuff in here, but yeah, I don't know if we would use these exact play through this campaign itself, just because of all the stuff. But lots of toys and bits and pieces to take to add into an existing campaign, which is always good. It will give this book legs that I don't think like Tyrannic War or even Pariah Nexus would necessarily have. Like, there's more here to use outside of this particular campaign. Well, that'll pretty much wrap up our episode, catching up on all the things that we missed since we had Midwest Conquest going on and such. So thank you for joining us for that. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with new stuff. And until then, if you want to help support us, there's 3 great ways you can do that. First is our Patreon at patreon.com/preferred enemies, where you can join the Preferred Frenemies community and help support us by helping people donating as patrons help pay for our web hosting and our recording service, help keep our mics going, and we love having you as part of our community. We don't put any of our episodes behind a paywall, but you do get access to like mission packs and things that we make for narrative play. So we really love to have you there, and there's no tiers. It's just like $1 a month, but enough people put in $1, it adds up against that, or that is at patreon.com/preferred enemies. We also have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/@preferred enemies. Like, subscribe, comment on videos, and we love seeing the numbers going up there. More people are getting engaged. Make fun of the silly shorts that I make out of outtakes from episodes and things like that. And then third, we have a merch store, preferredenemies.com/merch, where you can buy Preferred Enemies themed headgear, shirts, mugs, stickers, etc. But like I said, we'll be back in a couple of weeks. Until then, from all of us here at Preferred Enemies, I'm your host, Rob.
Kevin.
Dennis.
And Richard.
Good night, good gaming, and good God, those knights didn't need a point drop.